public space that looks at bridging the gap between the public and research. What we try and do here is not to look at sciences in the narrow sense of the natural sciences only, but to look at it more expansively as the natural sciences, the social sciences, art, design, humanities. What you'll see around you in the gallery is part of our vision to get collaborations between artists and scientists, and we hope that you'll also have the time after the lecture to take a look around. Carbon, which is our 6th exhibition season and the first one in this gallery, tries to take a look at the sort of complex relationship we have with the element, right? We don't want to see it simply as a villain. Of course, it drives the climate crisis, but it's also fundamental to life, life as organic beings. So what you'd see in the different galleries and, of course, in today's program is this exploration of carbon and its different facets. Before handing it over to Rohit Chandra, I'd just like to briefly introduce him too. Rohit Chandra is a political scientist and economic historian working primarily on energy, infrastructure, and varieties of capitalism in India. Over the last decade, he has worked in the policy space on coal sector reforms, the politics of state discoms, particularly in Jharkhand, and public finance decisions behind large infrastructure projects. He is currently an assistant professor at IIT Delhi's School of Public Policy. His work has recently expanded into the political economy of infrastructure finance, just transitions, and the characteristics of Indian capitalism. Without further ado, thanks, Rohit.
So first of all, thank you everyone for coming today. I know it's a long weekend. I know traffic in Bangalore is a mess, so I appreciate everyone who managed to make it here in person. And thank you to Ashank and Janvi and the rest of the program team for hosting me. It's always a pleasure to be at the Science Gallery, and this is my first time in this space as well. So I hope this is a space which many of you will come back to regularly. They do a lot of very good work here, and some of their exhibitions are fantastic. All of the coal exhibits are on the first floor, if you're interested, and I'll talk about some of them in a little bit. So as Ashank mentioned, I'm a political scientist and economic historian. I have a strange obsession with the Indian coal industry, and I've been putting together histories of this industry for the better part of the last decade. And so some of this work is going to be kind of reflections on the historical work that I've done, and some of it is going to be connecting it to current public policy debates, particularly about the rise of renewable energy, climate change, and all. So I'll talk for about 35, 40 minutes and then open it up for Q&A, and hopefully we can have some nice kind of discussions and conversations as well. So yeah, this is kind of the rough structure of the call. Everyone, please turn off your phones before we continue. Thank you very much. And so why should you care about this, right? The main reason, especially for those of you who may not be familiar, is that coal is still the majority source of power in this country, right? Almost 75% of all power generated in this country is generated from coal, and that hasn't particularly changed in the last decade, even with the rise of renewable energy, right? And so this is not going to change anytime soon, right? Obviously, it should decline. I'm not going to go into why climate change is important. I think hopefully you know that by now. I don't have time to explain everything. But assuming we want to address climate change, this has to go to low numbers or zero at some point in the next few decades, right? That's not easy, right? And part of what I'm going to present today is why it isn't easy, right? I think we know a lot of the techno-economic fixes which could solve climate change, renewable energy, this, that, and the other thing. I have spent a lot of time in these areas. So over the course of my PhD and the last decade of my work, I've spent almost 2 years in the coal belt. I visited every subsidiary of Coal India. I've interviewed almost every living chairman of Coal India. I have some sense of how this industry works at this point, both from a labor perspective and from a managerial perspective. And so I'm going to present all of those today. Where is India's coal today? 95% of India's coal is in that red box over there, right? There is some coal in Rajasthan, there's a little bit of lignite in Tamil Nadu, there's some kind of coal in the northeast, but for the most part, central and eastern India is where the majority of India's coal comes from, right? And these are kind of the 6 major states where they exist. Most of these are Coal India, and Andhra Pradesh has its own, or kind of now Telangana, I guess, has its own company called Singareni Coal Collieries Limited. Sorry for the oversight. I'm just going to walk through a very brief history of the coal industry because many of you may not be familiar with it. Obviously, a lot of industrial scale coal mining in India started in the late 1800s as kind of the British industrial state came to India and started extracting it at scale, both in Western India near Nagpur and all, and then primarily in Eastern India near Jharia, Dhanbad, and these kinds of places, right? Basically what happened around independence is a lot of this ownership transitioned from British ownership and British managing agencies into Indian hands, right? And so particularly in Eastern India, a lot of these owners were kind of Punjabi, Marwadi owners who were kind of business people in Eastern India who got controlling stakes in a lot of these mines, right? And basically this took about 5-10 years to happen. Administratively, it was complicated. There was still a lot of British capital in India after independence, and that slowly exited. And for the better part of the next 20, 25 years, you had hundreds of small players in the Indian coal industry who weren't particularly coordinated, who were trying to contribute to some kind of national energy project, right? And you had these interesting situations where the Planning Commission would say very big things about what should happen in the future, and then with very little coordination, very little of it would happen because coal consumers and coal buyers, coal sellers were not particularly coordinated. In a particular moment of, I think, both political and economic frustration, the industry was nationalized in the early 1970s. First coking coal in 1971 and then in 1973. And I'm going to talk about some of the justifications why in a little bit. Some of them are listed there. And so in 1975, you had this big company, which many of you may have heard of, called Coal India Limited, which was formed, right? And Coal India Limited still exists today. It produces almost more than 80% of domestic coal at this point, and is basically more or less a public sector monopoly of sorts, although there's a lot of other things happening under the surface which I think are worth understanding. And this is a period where a lot of external expertise came into this sector, right? So whether it's with Polish and Russian experts, the attenuation of kind of British technologies, underground mining started going away, open cast mining started coming in. In fact, you can see some of these in the exhibitions on the first floor, right? Kind of big strip open cast mines. I'll show you some pictures later. The next big breakpoint was around liberalization. This era from the 60s to the early 90s was state-led developmentalism. Most of these were public sector companies, not private sector companies, which were doing this work. Unfortunately, they were not particularly strong financially. Coal India rarely, if ever, made a profit, and the central budget often tended to be used to make the company whole, right? At this moment in time, the motto of Coal India was coal at any cost. It was more about energy security than kind of economic profitability. After 1991, this changed dramatically because one of the conditions of the IMF loans to India was that you cannot directly subsidize public sector companies anymore, right? They have to function on their own in competitive markets or whatever, right? Coal India more or less goes bankrupt by the mid-90s. It gets a big World Bank loan to kind of save it at the time. This is something the World Bank does not like talking about anymore because it has moved beyond coal at this point. But basically, the World Bank helped save Coal India at the time. This was still the primary source of power in India. And Coal India has undertaken a massive economic turnaround at this point, right? The company is massively profitable. We'll discuss this in a little bit. And it is publicly listed now, right? In 2009, it was publicly listed. About 40+% of the company is in public shareholding now. The government is still the majority shareholder, but you and I can buy shares in Coal India today, right? And so that's kind of brief history. Because I'm giving this talk in Bengaluru, I figured that I should talk about some of the figures from this region who are very, very involved, right? If you look at the geography, I mean, coal is a Eastern and Central problem, right? It's not a South Indian problem for the most part. However, the people who nationalized the coal industry were largely South Indian, right? So the first one was Mohan Kumaramangalam, right? So Mohan Kumaramangalam is a fascinating person, right? He was son of the Chief Minister of the Madras Presidency, Eton and Cambridge educated lawyer, born in the UK, and he was a well-known communist leader in Madras state in the 1960s. He was also very close to Indira Gandhi, right? And so when the split of the Congress party happened at some point, he switched to the Congress in the early 1960s, was a loyalist of Indira Gandhi, and eventually became the Minister of Steel and Mines in the 71 to 73 period. For the most part, he was the intellectual architect of coal nationalization, right? And he actually wrote an 80-page, almost like thesis on why the industry should be nationalized. And I'm happy to share this with any of you who are interested, right? The main reasons were unscientific mining, gross exploitation of labor by mining companies and landowners, and the difficulties of scale and planning, right? And this is a particular quote from him, which I'd like to read out just because I think he's far more articulate than I am, is that the takeover of government of all of these mines thus marks the end of an epoch in the coal mining industry and the opening of a new one. the ruthless profit hunting of the colliery owner, in which he acknowledged no limits of any kind, was ended, once and for all, with all the consequences for production, rational and scientific mining, and the good of the workers. For the first time in India's history, the proclaimed objective of the mining industry became the exploitation and use of India's most valuable mineral asset, coal, in the interest of the nation on the one hand and the workers on the other. Right? I mean, our ministers don't talk like this these days, right? But this is a fairly clear articulation of at least what his vision was, right? This is someone who was deeply influenced by kind of Fabian socialist and communist ideas, doing his law training in London, came back and was kind of trying to apply some of these ideas. By the way, coal nationalization in France and the UK had happened about 20, 25 years earlier, right? So this is not, in a global scale, this is not something new, right? This is kind of something which has been anticipated for almost decades in India because of all of these related problems, right? And so, unfortunately, Mohan Kumaramangalam died in an airplane accident in 1973, and so some of this agenda kind of petered out with his death and kind of other people taking over. But one of the people who was involved with him, who stuck around for the next 30, 40 years, was Mr. K.S.R. Chari, right? So Chari was a mining engineer who used to work with the National Coal Development Corporation and the State Railways Colliery Services. And at the time, the UPSC would actually put out advertisements for technical specialists in particular areas. And he became a technical advisor on coal mining to the Ministry of Steel and Mines before Kumaramangalam became coal minister. So he was one of the brains behind kind of the changes in coal mining in India. Basically, the moment Mohan Kumaramangalam became minister, he became Secretary Coal soon afterwards. And so he was responsible for most of the implementation, the ground level work on coal nationalization, which, by the way, included a lot of expropriation of private mine owners, right? So there's an entire generation of private mine owners, particularly in eastern India, who are quite aggrieved because their mines were taken away from them, their workers were taken away from them. Not all of them were compensated. In fact, many of them weren't. And so if you go to Calcutta, it's full of these kinds of stories of kind of aggrieved people who suffered nationalization. So he bought into this program wholesale. 20 years later, he started chairing committees both in the Planning Commission and various ministries, arguing that the coal sector should be opened up, right? That the private sector involvement should be allowed. This is quite a change for someone who has essentially been a state PSU employee for most of his life, right? And I think that disillusionment tells you a little bit about what wasn't working, right? Whether it's inefficiencies, whether it's the growth of criminalization in the industry, all of these kinds of things. Coal nationalization had high ideals. Many of them had not worked out, right? And so, there's all kinds of committee reports where Chari is writing very openly on all of these things. And so I think these two gentlemen were disproportionately involved in the nationalization of the coal industry. You don't usually, you hear about Mohan Kumaramangalam a fair amount. You don't hear much about Mr. Chari. And so I thought that you should know that, there were South Indians very involved in this industry. And even today, you have a bunch of people, especially people who run the industry. The director of business development is currently someone who came from Singareni Coal Collieries Limited. The current chairman of Coal India actually has his origins in Andhra Pradesh as well. And so this is actually something which is a very Indian industry. Tamil subcontractors are all over the mining industry in eastern India, right? And so this is something which does have kind of very Indian origins in that sense. It's not just an eastern or central India problem. However, I think one of the things one of the things was when Coal India was first created, it had almost 7 lakh employees. This is by far one of the biggest employers in the Indian public sector. Over the last 50 years, this number has shrunk dramatically, right? So I think Coal India has somewhere on the order of 2.2 lakh employees. If you add Singareni, that's around 2.5 lakh total. This is permanent pensioned workforce, right? And so that's interesting because at one level, you've had massive decreases in employment. On the other hand, production has gone up almost kind of 7x during that time, right? So from 100 million tons during the 1970s, it's around 700 now. If we include coal imports, which is not produced domestically, it's even higher, right? The government of India has put out targets of mining 1 billion tons of coal. This number isn't decreasing, right? And so obviously a lot of this has happened on the back of heavy mechanization and capital intensity, right? And so this is just a map of kind of the output per man shift or kind of the productivity trends across different subsidiaries of Coal India. Sorry, these are all the different regional subsidiaries of Coal India, if I didn't make that clear earlier. And so you can see that some of them have been incredibly efficient. These are the ones which have big machines and less people. And these are the ones which have more underground mines and more people, right? So even within Coal India, there's massive heterogeneity in both the technical approaches to mining and the relationship with local areas as a consequence, right? And I'll show you some pictures about this. So, this is all very nice, these graphs and everything, but I think to really understand the coal industry, you have to see what it looks like. And I think that's one thing which the Science Gallery actually does very nicely, whether it's Ishant Pankha's work on what's going on in Jharkhand, whether it's some of kind of the views of the mining industry, or whether it's Ronnie Sen's work on Jharia and the coal fires there. There's a lot of visualizations up in kind of on the first floor, which I think show the industry as it should be. Full disclosure, some of these pictures are from my PhD students. I did not take them, so I should give her credit for it. But this is the scale of what open cast mines look like in India, right? And just to give you a sense, I mean, that horizon in the back can possibly like be 1 or 2 kilometers away sometimes, right? I mean, it's pretty far, right? You have entire new artificial mountains which are created when you have all of this overburden taken out during mining, right? And unfortunately, for various reasons, it's not backfilled, the reclamation doesn't happen properly, and so there's a whole kind of politics and economics of that. And oftentimes, the labor conditions, especially, so what I showed you earlier was 220,000 formal workers. What I didn't tell you was the other 150 to 200,000 contractual workers who sometimes live in the mines and shacks like this, right? So, I mean, obviously a bunch of Mohan Kumaramangalam's vision didn't come to pass, especially after this mass contractualization started. Mining is not separate from agriculture, right? And especially in India's mines, these are not walled off. You don't have barbed wire around them. Because of the nature of social contract in many of these areas, local people have access to mines for all kinds of purposes, and I'll show you what they do there at night and other kinds of things. But literally, you can have farms right next to mines. You have these problems where cattle will randomly fall in, or children will randomly fall in. Like this is something which is kind of a larger evolving negotiation between local communities and mining companies, right? And you have all kinds of blasting going on, right? How do you create something like this? Well, you put lots of explosives into the ground, you blow it up, you put it in trucks, you move it out, right? You move it from there to up here, right? That blasting has major consequences for local construction and other kinds of things. So these are kind of major regional problems that emerge. Underground coal mining was the history of India's coal industry, right? Less than 10% of coal mining today, less than 5% actually, is done underground. But for the better part of the first 60, 70 years, from 1900 to 1940, 1950, most of it was underground mining, British-style underground mining, right? That's also where most of the employment is. Underground mining tends to require much more manpower. You can't use machines as much for those kinds of things. And so, as you can start seeing, like India's coal labor can look very different. Running this kind of machine is very different from going into a mine and working underground and those kinds of things, right? So even kind of the worlds of labor and the kinds of work that people are subjected to, the kinds of things they do daily, can vary quite dramatically. It's also very big, right? These are people, these are the machines. These are some of the biggest machines you will probably see in certain kinds of industrial equipment, right? Other than power plants and steel plants. This is kind of the biggest kind of earth-moving equipment. This is still on the smaller side. Right, there's stuff even bigger than this. And coal moves massive distances, right? Just because the coal is in Eastern India doesn't mean the power plants are in Eastern India, right? If any of you have gone through India, whether it's Maharashtra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, you have coal-based power plants everywhere, Punjab. That means thousands of these coal rakes are moving every day. Each of these probably moves about 50 to 100,000 kilos of coal at a time, right? And 700 million tons of this kind of stuff is moving across the country every year. Coal as freight is the biggest source of revenue for Indian railways. About 40 to 45% of Indian railways' revenue comes just from coal freight. Freight revenue comes, and because freight cross-subsidizes passenger traffic, right? Often passenger traffic does not make money, so it would not be wrong to say that the Indian railways depends on Coal India for its financial existence, right? These things radiate well beyond just the coal belt, right? Especially the financial implications. One of the unfortunate things about the coal industry is that women don't work in it for the most part, right? Because of older colonial laws which basically basically banned women from working in underground mines for legitimate public health and other kinds of reasons, right? I mean, there are all kinds of horror stories from Britain where like women were giving birth underground because they were living underground, all of this kind of stuff. There was a kind of backlash in the UK or in Britain in the late 1800s. A lot of those laws carried over to India as well. So today you will not see women working in Indian mines anywhere, right? They do work in other parts of Coal India, whether it's at secretarial staff, coal transportation, but unfortunately, a lot of women who kind of work in the coal industry are doing adjacent jobs which have nothing to do with mining, right? And especially because coal and forests tend to be somewhat co-located in India quite a lot, they often do various other things around. So the point is that there's 220,000 formal employees. It's not their wives who are doing this, right? It's the other, my estimate is, and I'll show you some maps for this, about 10 million people are dependent on coal for their livelihood every day in India, between workers and their families, right? And most of them are doing this, not working in the mines, right? So there's a massive informal coal economy which exists around most mining regions in India. I think Singareni is one of the exceptions, but whether you go to West Bengal, whether you go to Chhattisgarh and Korba, whether you go to Hazaribagh and Ramgarh, whether you go to Chandrapur in Maharashtra, you'll see this happening everywhere. Most of these people are not doing this because they want to, right? It's because there's very little other opportunity around them. This is a stable source of income. And most importantly, coal can be sold to anyone as a fuel, right? Whether it's the local chaiwala, whether it's a brick kiln, whether it's a small-scale industry. Using coal as a source of fuel has actually has a very long history in India. You can't do this with iron ore, you can't do this with other kinds of mining. But with coal, you have a ready market nearby, right? So as long as you can put a few hundred kilos on your cycle and bring it somewhere, you can make sure that you make at least a few hundred rupees a day. That's easier than many other kinds of things. And most coal mining areas are net out-migration areas, right? Other than coal-related stuff, there isn't that much kind of employment. In districts like Korba, 60% of district GDP comes from coal mining or adjacent activities, right? 15% of Chhattisgarh's state revenue comes from coal mining royalties, right? So there's a lot of dependence, which is not just livelihood dependence, but also fiscal dependence, also economic dependence. And so that complicates the issue a little bit. And then obviously, there's massive problems related to it as well, right? Coal dust, it affects agriculture very badly, all the transportation dust-related problems, right? Most coal mining areas, air pollution is horrible, incidences of lung diseases and lung cancers and all of these are much higher. And so this is an industry which has massive externalities, massive problems, and yet is the lifeblood of the Indian power system, right? Naturally, a fairly big tension. You can't snap your fingers and wish it away. At the same time, you need it to go away in the next 20, 30 years if you want to address climate change in any reasonable way, right? So, I'm not offering any solutions at this moment, but just kind of setting up what the problem looks like. Here's some more adventurous people transporting coal. Here's the effect that coal takes on local infrastructures, because most of them weren't actually built for thousands of kilos of coal being moved across small bridges. And you actually have a fair bit of community resistance as well, right? So one of the biggest things that happens with coal is, imagine that big open cast coal mine. Someone has to acquire that land. The way the Coal Mines Nationalization Act is written, any land that has coal beneath it belongs to the government of India. But if historically it belonged to someone else, they still need to acquire it. They still need to pay for it, right? What does that compensation look like? Who gets jobs? This has been a negotiation for the better part of the last half century in India. And there's lots of protests, public hearings, other kinds of things that happen. There is a formality that there should be, not a formality, it's a necessity, a legal necessity that there should be public hearings when any big land acquisition happens. This is the kind of circumstance they often happen in, right? They're highly securitized, they don't always include people. And so needless to say, there's a lot of contestation around the coal industry and who can make claim on it, right? This is actually a very nice picture from one of my students' fieldwork on coal community activism, where basically the people who were doing this, I think this is somewhere near Korba, called it coal satyagraha, right? And the idea was that, look, the government takes all of this coal, it doesn't get used locally, we don't benefit from it. We may as well use it ourselves, right? This is definitely not the dominant narrative. I think the Indian security state and Indian coal companies have worked fairly well together to make sure that we have our ACs and we have 75% of our power and all of these kinds of things. But the point is this kind of stuff also does happen, right? And you only really understand it when you go out into the field. In fact, a very well-known kind of anti-coal activist, Alok Shukla, just won the Green Nobel in I think the Philippines or somewhere, right? So, I mean, these people are getting noticed well outside. Also, the Indian security state tends to file a lot of cases against them, right? So all of this is happening. So this is just some background because I think many people are just not familiar with the visual reality of what the coal industry looks like. But then what do we do going forward, right? Obviously, decarbonization is necessary. I'm not going to talk about why we need to decarbonize, but one of the kind of phrases that's been used a lot in especially policy circles is this idea of just transitions, right? How do you have an energy transition which is just to the people who work in these industries, who live around them, who are dependent on them? So this is a map. You know, the black outlines are what coal mines are, and then these are buffers around them. If you just take a 25-kilometer buffer or a 50-kilometer buffer around coal mines, and you make a conservative assumption that a third of the people in these areas are dependent on the coal industry or someone, you get to 10, 15 million people relatively quickly, right? The point is that this is not a small problem, right? Coal India may only employ 220,000 people, but my estimate, and then other people have kind of independently done this as well, is that 10 to 15 people depend on coal for their daily livelihood, whether it's a family member, a father, someone else, right? The economic multipliers of coal are huge, right? And what I mean by this is that the only reason you have certain kinds of commercial activity in certain coal-bearing areas is because coal money exists there, right? Whether it's kirana shops, whether it's jewelry shops, whether it's other kinds of things, you know, all kinds of fast-moving consumer goods. Part of the reason they exist there is because the coal industry exists there, right? And so it's not just about phasing out the industry, but it's also about figuring out what is the economic imagination for these areas post-coal. This is a story we have seen before in other parts of the world, whether it's in West Virginia in the US or the Ruhr Valley in Germany. One of the big problems is that most of these places turn into ghost towns where only older people live and young people leave because there's no opportunity. India can't afford this because the bottom 20, 30% can't even afford to migrate out of these places in a lot of these regions, right? One of the unfortunate consequences of coal is this natural resource scarce idea, right? That because there's coal there, no one invests in anything else because they assume coal will take care of people. How do we undo that? I think that's one of the big questions in policy. And I want to disabuse one of these notions that like renewable energy is going to save the world in these regions. It's not, and let me show you why, right? So this is where the coal is. I've shown you this earlier. The red regions in these maps are where the best locations for wind and solar are in India, right? Solar on the left, wind on the right. Basically, it's all in western and southern India. If you look at grid-connected renewable energy in India today, over 95% of it comes from western and southern India, 6 states, right? It is not coming from this region. I hope that at some point, some private investor decides to make solar energy in India. As someone was telling me yesterday, Bihar and Jharkhand and West Bengal, although they may have lower solar kind of insolation, it's still more than any part of Germany, right? So there is a resource, but we also have low power prices, and so there's all kinds of regional mismatches for this kind of thing, right? So far, India's renewable energy policies, I mean, this is going to be a double whammy for coal regions, right? They're going to lose coal, they're going to lose the revenue associated with that, and they're not really benefiting from the renewable energy economy. I mean, they may benefit from public health, they may benefit from a cleaner energy system, but it's certainly not creating employment jobs or any of these other kinds of things, right? One of the phrases I tend to use in a lot of my presentations is, would Tanishq exist in Dhanbad without coal, right? And I think this is the kind of consumption question that you have to think about if you care about these regions. And I'm from these regions, so I obviously care about it, right? And so I think what's, in modern policy lingo, I think one of the ways of thinking about this is kind of what is the relationship between coal and K-shaped growth, right? Especially COVID, this has become kind of a big thing, right? That you have this divergence between the people who are really, really benefiting and the ones who aren't. And I think, unfortunately, coal is symptomatic of some of the larger problems in the Indian economy today, right? Coal India is a massively profitable company. It's 37,000 crores in last fiscal year. This is a lot of money. Most of this money is not making it to the regions it's actually operating in, right? And so, I think historically, especially kind of post-nationalization, at least for a few decades, there was this sense of local developmentalism which was embedded into these companies, right? Coal India still runs housing for over 1 million people. It probably provides water for a few million people every year. It has a developmental footprint which is partly filling the vacuum that these regional state governments have left behind, unfortunately, right? I think a lot of that DNA, unfortunately, has retreated once the company has become financialized, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing in some kind of macro sense, right? Economists will tell you that this is efficient. It's not efficient for Eastern India and the coal belt, right? And so how do you think of regional developmentalism when even the company which is operating there is taking this money and basically paying it as dividends and other kinds of things to the central government? Now, some of that is good, right? A lot of these dividends and all of this money which is being paid to the central government is actually being used for non-coal activity, right? Because Coal India is a huge contributor to the kind of central pool, that money is being used for solar construction, for kind of next generation technologies, investing in all of this. Again, this stuff is not being invested in these areas, right? When was the last time you saw a solar panel kind of manufacturing plant in Jharkhand or West Bengal and all, right? You would think that there'd be some kind of compensatory economic activity in kind of a larger planning perspective, but partly because of the nature of our politics and other kinds of things, that just has not happened, right? Despite that, Coal India has major credibility in these regions, right? If you ask me who is capable of doing economic development at scale in these areas, there's very few private companies, except maybe other than the Tatas, who've actually done anything at scale in these areas. Coal India has built entire cities and towns, right? I can point to at least 10 different towns and cities where 20 years ago, the best school and the best hospital used to be run by Coal India. In the last 20 years, there's been a lot more private entry, so that has changed. But Coal India was a major public good provider. But I think a lot of this credibility is being used in the local political economy to further resource extraction. And so, part of my larger kind of idea, especially when I was doing my PhD, was this idea of adaptive state capitalism, right? What role do public sector companies play in the energy transition? Are they just technology procurement companies? Are they just supporting technologies which are not ready for the market, like green hydrogen, all of this kind of stuff, right? The only buyers of hydrogen in this country right now are oil refiners, right? No one else wants to buy it because it's too expensive. So essentially, they're paying the price for something which is expensive at the moment, right? And then providing intermediation in place which is hard to do business. This is what these guys are doing right now. I think they can do more, right? Not necessarily consonant with the current government's more market fundamentalist view of viewing things, but given that you have a lack of private sector economic actors in large parts of the Indian coal belt, can you also use these companies as vehicles of alternative local economic imagination, right? Can you use them as, a bank for SMEs? Can you have them work with state governments on doing developmental activities which are not related to coal? And interestingly enough, Coal India is getting into non-coal activities. They have a new position called the Director of Business Development, whose entire job it is to figure out non-coal activities which Coal India can diversify in from. This is more of a top-down corporate thing than a bottom-up developmental goal. But these are some interesting things which are happening, right? For this to happen, I think you also need to keep government at an arm's length from decision-making of these companies. I've interviewed hundreds of people who have worked at these companies. They care about the places they live in, right? But they often do not have the financial agency to make those calls at the end of the day because their companies' boards are filled with IS officers who live in Delhi and other kinds of places, and they have different priorities, right? And so part of it is kind of, is there a way of bringing back that developmental imagination given this kind of massive economic sucking sound that you see from these areas? And can you have more diverse communities making claims on their activities, right? So one of the things I didn't talk about today, but I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A, is that Jharkhand is a very interesting example of coal mining where you have an entire new generation of tribal subcontractors who are working in the Indian coal industry, right? 20, 30 years ago, they probably didn't exist. But now they're playing by the rules of this game, which also means that they're becoming Coal India's contractors. They're making their claims on a public system, right? That's far from inclusion, but I think it's a direction which I think can be emphasized even further. I remember I had a conversation with a former chairman of MCL who was particularly frustrated with out-of-state contractors dominating local contracts in Odisha, right? And so he actually encouraged the growth of local Odia cooperatives to compete with these outside contractors, gave them nominated contracts, and managed to make it more competitive. Coal India is a massively privatized company at this point. 60% of Coal India's operations happen in outsourced coal mines, which means that you basically have private subcontractors working on Coal India-owned coal mines, right? That's an opportunity actually to figure out how to give those contracts to different people. In theory, yes, you have tendering and it's competitive and all of these kinds of things. In practice, this is always politically influenced, right? And depending on who's in power and all of these kinds of things, it tends to get pushed in one direction or another. So how can you use this as a vehicle of local developmentalism to make sure that different people get contracts? That it's not just the biggest fish, the usual suspects who do it, right? So I think there's three phases. You know, if you have to remember anything from this presentation, remember the three phases of the Indian coal industry. Pre-91, it was coal at any cost, right? Post-91, the profit motive kicks in. It matters. Can the next phase be decarbonization and taking the green economy seriously, right? And I would argue that I think things are slowly moving in this direction. They need to do much more so. But how do you make state capitalism work with decarbonization? This is the million-dollar question as far as I'm concerned. If you figure out this question, you can make a lot of money. So good luck. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions now.